Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Beth Keene, and I'm the CEO for Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Building Bridges, a cross-cultural dialogue about confronting racism. Before we start the program, I would like to pay tribute to our beloved survivor and longtime board member, Frank Schiller, who sadly passed away over the weekend. I'm had the chance to work with Frank for many years. His passing is a great loss for our community, and we send our condolences to his son, Gary, who was also a longtime board member and honorary, and his entire family. Our goal at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust is to learn from one of the darkest times in our past in order to promote a more respectful, dignified, and humane future. The history that we teach demonstrates the horrific outcome that can result when any one group is marginalized and seen as less worthy than other groups. The death of George Floyd at the hands of the police in Minneapolis has brought us to this moment in history when we must confront the racism that continues to pervade our society. For us as a Holocaust museum, it is critical to foster dialogue between the different groups that make up the rich history of our diverse community. It's our hope that this dialogue today between leaders working for social justice will be a step in the direction of understanding each other, supporting each other, and creating a more just society for all. I'd like to welcome our 5 panelists today: Michael Lawson, President and CEO of Los Angeles Urban League; Helen Torres, CEO of Hispanas, Organized for Political Equality; Charlie Wu, Board Chair for Center Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment; Julie Bank, Board Chair for Jewish Center for Justice; and Chief from the Los Angeles Police Department. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan currently presents a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain and was the person for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan has been an advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Broad Education Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, the James Irvine Foundation, the Public Policy Institute of California, and the Stewart Foundation on a variety of K-12 education and college and workforce preparedness efforts. He is a graduate of the American University in Washington, DC. Dan, I want to thank you for helping us create this program and serving as moderator. And one last thing, I just want everyone to know that this event will be recorded and we'll be sharing the link once it's ready on our website. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Dan Schnur. Thank you.
Beth, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much as well for putting together this program. I also want to thank Jill Brown and Safina Goldstein on the museum staff for all the work they've done to make this happen. And a special thanks to our panelists for taking the time away from their very busy schedules to join us today. And of course, to all of you as our attendees. We're thrilled to have you here. And our hope is that as we go through a conversation before our hour concludes, that we'll be able to take questions from some of you, which you ought to be able to enter into the Q&A function of the Zoom site. So we've named today's program, Building Bridges, a cross-cultural dialogue about confronting racism. There's a lot of different ways we felt to talk about, to examine, to reflect on the events of the last couple of weeks. And all of the panelists, myself included, felt that talking about the necessary collective action that we can take working together across traditional community boundaries would be the most effective way for us to begin. there's a famous quote from Mark Twain, which I'm guessing that many of you know. Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself."
How do I get the?
Chief Moore, I think we have you on. Are you there, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for joining us. We've got you audibly, now we just need the visual, and we'll be all set. Okay. So as I said, Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes," which means that the challenges that we're facing today are nothing new. This country has faced challenges of racial division and animus since before there was a country.
I'll zoom for any privacy.
Today we'll be discussing what we can do to make sure that rhyme is somewhat different this time than it has been in the past. One other thought that I'll offer you before we begin to engage our panel, and that's a poem that many of you are familiar with from the German Lutheran pastor and theologian Martin Niemöller. And Pastor Niemöller wrote a poem just after World War II, addressing the Nazis' rise to power before the war and the public reaction to it. And there's several different versions of this poem that have circulated over the decades. This is the one that I've found, and I'll start our conversation with this. Niemöller once said, he said, "First they came for the incurables, and I did not speak out because I was not an incurable. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out," he said, "because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." So many of us today, we use that language as an affirmation of solidarity and mutual commitment. But when Niemöller first wrote that poem in 1946, he wrote it as a post-war confession and admonishment for those who did not stand up in the face of injustice. And so today what we'll do with our panelists who Beth introduced for you is today we're going to discuss how to confront these challenges now in real time, rather than looking back once again with regret for not acting as forcefully as we know we could. So I'm going to go to each of our panelists in turn to ask them a question. And then we'll go through a couple rounds of questions that I pose to the panelists. And then time permitting, as I mentioned earlier, we'd very much like to hear your questions as well. Please send them to us in the Q&A function of Zoom. So we're going to start with Michel Lawson. And Michel, as Beth mentioned, is the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League. And Michel, we're so happy to have you here with us today. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I guess where I'd start with you on this, Michel, is what happens next? What happens after the peaceful protests? As I mentioned earlier, why will things be different this time when we haven't made as much change as we would have liked to in the past? It's like before I step aside, Michel, I'm going to recognize Chief Michael Moore from the LAPD for joining us. We're happy to have you with us, sir. We'll be coming to you in just a few minutes. But Michel, that's my question to you. What happens next? And why should we be encouraged or optimistic that things will be different this time as we rise to this challenge?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Museum of the Holocaust for sponsoring this. This is a great question because we have been here before. And the changes that were made in relation to those events, we made some progress, but we stepped back. And the changes weren't structural as they needed to be. There are a number of things that are different than what happened in 1992 with the Rodney King situation. The first is the multicultural nature of the protesters. I am so gratified by when I look out and I see this rainbow coalition of people who are standing up and saying, no, this is not right. And I give significant credit to that, to the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been very loudly and in some cases, irritatingly, keeping this in top of mind. And I think the irritating part of it was necessary, was absolutely necessary to get everybody's attention. And so it's those two things are critical. The coalitions that are being built, and the fact that it's not just what we're hearing are discussions about not just tinkering around the edges, but looking at the fundamental structure of how we do policing in this country. Oh, and don't let me forget that is not just the protests in Minneapolis or the protests in Los Angeles, but these protests are around the world. And so there is a difference here. We have been fighting this fight for a long time. Johnny Cochran was fighting this fight for a long time, suing the police and getting judgments. And Connie Rice has been doing the same thing. But there's been kind of a shift. And the shift, part of the difference is that after Rodney King, we went through kind of the same steps that we had gone through before, got a consent decree from the federal government, there was oversight and so on and so forth, and some significant procedural changes were made that were important. But after the consent decree ended, we started slipping back. And what we're hearing now, what we're discussing now is a question of whether the fundamental structure of our policing in the US is the right one. Part of the question is, are we asking the police to do things that we shouldn't be asking police to do? That is one part of the equation. But the other part of the equation is to what extent are we holding police officers accountable? And thirdly, I don't want to miss out on the fact that leadership has changed. And that is a significant issue. We have leadership that is willing to step out and say loudly and proudly that what has happened is not acceptable. Starting with the mayor of Minneapolis, who said these officers should be not just fired, but arrested. And that kind of, you didn't hear that before. You didn't hear that in 1992. You may have heard some discussions behind closed doors, but people weren't shouting it to the people in authority weren't shouting it to the rooftops. And also I want to give credit to Chief Moore as well, because what we have had in the past are chiefs who would only walk the party line. They thought their job was to protect their officers and not change their officers. Now, I have my criticisms of Chief Moore. We have our discussions and we will go back and forth. But we have these factors are all in place now that weren't in place in 1992. So I am very hopeful that we will make some significant progress here, make some significant changes. And I applaud the protesters. I applaud Black Lives Matter, and I applaud the leadership in our elected leadership for also being willing to take bold action that would not have gone over well at all, or just wouldn't have gone anywhere in 1992.
Michael, thank you so much. And we're going to be very interested, of course, to hear Chief Moore's perspective on some of the questions you've raised in just a couple of minutes. But I do want to include our other community leaders as well. And I'm going to go next to Helen Torres. Helen is the CEO of the organization HOPE, which stands for Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. And I've had the privilege of working with Helen on a number of programs over the years. But more recently, Helen has been part of a cross-community coalition that's done some research on Californians' attitudes on questions relating to race relations and discrimination. And Helen, I think Michael makes a really good point, that some of this is about changing rules about laws and regulations. Some of this is about attitudes. Can you give us some insight based on this research on how Californians have felt about these type of challenges?
Happy to, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. As has been mentioned, HOPE stands for Hispanas, Organized for Political Equality. And just for those that are not familiar with the organization, we're a leadership advocacy organization on behalf of Latinas across the nation, but focused here in California. And it's been wonderful to be part of this coalition with the Urban League and Cause to really start understanding how we feel about race relations in the state and also in the nation. When we took our poll back, and it seems like it was way back in February of 2020, obviously the world has changed drastically for two major occurrences, both COVID-19 and the occurrences that are now, have always been present, but now being discussed more through the protests because of the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing discrimination and racism that we've been feeling in our system has finally come to a watershed moment where this is a tipping point for our community. And so the poll, two questions that I wanted to bring up that we answered through the poll that we asked people to, and these were white Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans that answered our poll. And one of those were how they were feeling about race relations in the context of the United States, California, and then their neighborhood. And overwhelmingly, it was that the United States was not on the right track when it came to race relations. And this is back in February, remember, 32% said that only good to excellent. So that meant the vast majority didn't think we were in a good place. Then when it came to California, it got a little better. From excellent to good, it was about 52%. But when it came to the neighborhoods, when people were talking about race relations and how they were feeling in their neighborhoods, that really jumped up to close to 72%. So we really saw a difference about how people felt the United States was dealing with race relations, California was dealing with race relations, and how they felt about their own neighborhoods. We also asked another question that I wanted to ensure that we were all discussing in this conversation was the question of, are things getting better? Is race relations getting better? And we asked this from a United States perspective and a California perspective. And from the United States perspective, only 10% of people felt that things were getting better. And this is back in February again, where 20% felt that California things were getting better. So what this communicated to me was that there seemed to be an abundance of support and conversations perhaps happening at the local level, at our neighborhood levels, but we weren't satisfied with what was happening in California, and we definitely weren't satisfied with what was happening in the United States. So what does this mean? How do we translate this as leaders and coalition builders? It means that even then in February, we knew that we weren't in a place that we wanted to be with race relations, that things were not getting better, but we were feeling good about our local neighborhoods. It also says that perhaps with everything that we've experienced in the last 3 weeks, that we were in a place of complacency, that we all got very comfortable with the status quo, and we're not listening to a lot of our communities that were suffering with the fact that the status quo is not okay. So this is a real call for action. It's a real time for us to not only look to our elected leaders and our institutional leaders, but to ourselves and our neighborhoods and our neighbors to really say, how do we change things? How do we go beyond a protest to actually being involved in the everyday decisions that affect all of us?
Helen, thank you so much. The next we're going to bring in Charlie Wu, and Charlie's the board chair of the Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, the organization Cause. And I've had the privilege of working with Charlie as a member of Cause's board and as part of the coalition that Helen has been talking about also. Charlie, Helen cited poll results, from just a few months ago, but given the events of the last that have occurred since then, they may have been just years ago. In other words, Charlie, attitudes on topics like these, sensitive topics about race relations and discrimination, public attitudes can change very quickly in response to real world events, can't they?
Yes, they certainly can. First of all, I want to thank the Museum of Holocaust and Dan for putting this event together. And I'm so pleased to be part of the dialogue. As Dan mentioned that we did a poll, with emphasis on the feelings and opinions of the communities of color, which have often neglected in traditional polls. And then the COVID-19 hit. As some of you may know, that the Asian Pacific American community had unprecedented challenge. That COVID-19 pandemic had been an unprecedented challenge. In addition to worry about the personal safety and safety of our families, we suffer through unprecedented anti-Asian discrimination because of the false belief that Asian Americans are somehow foreigners, that bringing in, carrying with them a foreign virus, come to this country to spread a virus to hurt all Americans. And somehow with the belief that if we all go away, the country would have been better. I mean, that is really a devastating blow to the community. The poll indicated that long before the COVID-19 pandemic in February, we recognized the challenges, the discriminations. However, we still maintain a very positive outlook about our future in this country. We believe that we will eventually be accepted. As a matter of fact, 83% of Asian Americans embraced American identity. By the same percentage, they embraced being residents and taking roots in California. At the same ratio, they also embraced their own racial identity and culture. To Asian Americans, it's not a choice between being an Asian, embracing Asian culture, and American being fully participated in the American dialogue and contribution. So to be treated as a foreigner, to remind of the myth that we don't really belong, we are perpetual foreigner. And that doesn't just happen to the new immigrants, to maybe the working class. It happened to, regardless of where we are, what we do. Even many of the doctors, healthcare professionals, nurses, saving lives during this pandemic are being targeted for discrimination. So that is really a wake-up call that we felt that we couldn't be silent anymore. And then came the racial tension. Actually, a ethnic Chinese American reporter called me yesterday, asked me two questions. Number one, what do I think the reason behind all the outpour support for, supporting, to support the movement against racism and police brutality. And Asians also care a lot about law and order, police protection, because yes, Asian, because of the insecurity they feel in this country, they rely heavily on police and government protections in many areas. If we condemn the police, aren't we in conflict? I say, wait a minute, let's separate in two things. Supporting, fighting against racial discrimination, condemning police brutality, and ask for improvement of the police, go back to the basic principle to serve and to protect. They are not contradictory. I mean, yes, I'm not an African American. I don't experience the suffering they have gone through, but we are all parents. I have two sons. If you tell me that my son would go out to jog in the neighborhood and wouldn't come back, like Ahmad Arbery, Laquan McDonald, if you tell me my kids were driving and stopped for minor traffic violations like Philando Castile and Sandra Brand and end up dead and wouldn't come back. And if you tell me that even when police have the suspect under control and they don't need to use a gun and by hand or by their body, they could kill somebody. That's not something that we want in America. This is not something that we want in our own country. If we embrace our Americanness, we have to speak up. I mean, Asian Americans tend to be silent. We tend to be sort of push things aside and do it quietly. But this racism has been so blatant against our community, against African Americans. It's so open. It's so blatant. It affects everybody. So we cannot be silent anymore. As for the police and where we stand with the police, I mean, I remind the reporters, there are many police departments in this country. There are better departments and worse departments. And even within the LAPD, there are better cops and not so good cops. And then when we come to the conflict between peaceful protests and looting and property destruction, I think there is a belief going on there. Property destruction is not a big deal because property can be replaced. But to many Asian American and small business owners, that's not that simple. First of all, many of the small businesses might not be fully insured. Even if they're fully insured, they might not have the sophistication and the proper accounting and documentation of the loss that they suffer that can get that compensation. Even if they could, because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, many small and minority-owned businesses are hanging by a thread. And any further destruction, loss of confidence, it really take a big chunk out of a vibrant community where commerce and business jobs is a major part of the community development. So, when I saw that the police were concentrating on dealing with the peaceful protester, granted a small number of the peaceful protesters end up looting and destroying properties. And then you have a different group of people unrelated to the protest, looting and engaged in property destruction. And when the police were in the same scene with controlling the peaceful protester, and it appears there's no police present when it comes to destroying the communities and the business and the commerce and our livelihood. And that's a painful memory that Koreans, Americans, Asian Americans were abandoned. And we had to take up, Korean Americans take up arms to protect their own community. That, I submit to you, is very dangerous. I mean, one side note is that Asian Americans are buying arms because of the discrimination, buying arms to protect themselves during the pandemic discrimination, and more so during this current crisis. That is dangerous. And I submit to you, we must have faith in law enforcement to protect and to serve, but we have to deal with the problem of police brutality. And I think that is a separate but equally important issues.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And I also want to thank our audience member who sent in a very thoughtful question, pointing out that racism and discrimination is experienced by each of these communities, and as an Asian American individual who sent in that question. So thank you for engaging in the discussion through writing. We're going to go next to Julie Bank. Julie's the board chair for Jewish Center for Justice. And I must tell you that Julie and her colleagues have become just extraordinary leaders in the fight for social justice in our community, along the lines of what Michael and Helen and Charlie have been talking about for the last several minutes. So Julie, we welcome you to this conversation as well. And the question I'd like to ask you is, what is the role of the Jewish community, more specifically, in these efforts? Not all of our audience is Jewish, of course, but a good percentage is. What should we as Jews be thinking about? What's our role here?
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much for having me be a part of this panel with these incredible thought leaders in our community. And I just want to tell everyone who doesn't know what Jewish Center for Justice is that we are a social justice, education, and leadership development platform that empowers current and future leaders to build a more compassionate and just society. And exactly what we're trying to do here is what we need to be doing as a Jewish community. We need to be listening and learning. We need to be coming together with people from our broad community. And we really need to take this time for introspection. We can't presume that we know what the issues are or how to fix them. And we really have been we've been asleep to the deep issues of systematic racism for too long. Jews have historically, American Jews have been at the forefront of the fight for civil rights. Everything from voting rights to desegregation of schools. We have been there for a great many of the moments of progress, but we have to face now the hard work that we have to do in the present. And we, as a Jewish community, we really have to reimagine our role in that. We have to look at our own conscious and unconscious biases and think hard and deeply about those. We have to look within ourselves and our community and examine how we have been complicit in the structure of racism. And we must take what we're learning about ourselves and root out the structural racism, not only in the larger community, but in our own communities as well.
Julie, thank you so much. And now I'm very glad to be able to welcome Chief Moore to our conversation. Chief, any number of points have come up from our other panelists that I know you'd be interested and eager to address, but I guess the broader question I'd put to you, given how so much of the conversation to this point has been about cross-community partnerships and cooperations, the question I'd ask of you, sir, is what is the role that the police can play in helping us move forward, in working with our communities collaboratively to make progress on such a difficult challenge?
Well, and thank you, Dan, for the opportunity to be on this meeting today, as well as the other thought leaders that are here, Ms. Bank, Mr. Lawson, Ms. Torres, and Charlie Wu from the Asian American United for Self-Empowerment. And I also want to thank the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust for hosting this entire engagement. The role that we play, first of all, I believe, is to acknowledge the enormity of what the moment is before us and its origin. And I think the origins of racism and systemic challenges that this country, our nation has had over time, has had similar moments in the past. And I think today the role for LAPD and for me as its chief is to not just call out the wrongs and allow and hear people as they express their grievances or hate or frustration about the settings and circumstances in which they find themselves. But where do we go from here? Do we set out a course of action that shows actual progress? We have accomplished much here in Los Angeles, and I believe that we need to, there will be a time to talk and identify about that, but that time is not now, because people are frustrated, they're grieving, they're hurt, and they're not into having a chief tell them about the reforms that we've made in the last decade and the diversity in our personnel and the systems and controls. What they want to hear is what's going to change going forward. And that's where the mayor's initiatives, that's where the Board of Police Commissioners last Wednesday in their announcement about continuing expanding our community engagement, ensuring that programs such as our community safety partnerships, which assign officers to small local neighborhoods, and those officers stay there, become like a beat cop. They get to know the personnel that are there, the children, but also the adults and the seniors, and they form a collective bond of a shared responsibility for the safety of that neighborhood. And the police are not just the enforcers, the police are partners to ensuring that city services and other needs are met and can bring light to that. That's what that building of trust in those engagements versus the over-policing or the rallying of additional uniform officers and detailing them in areas that are experiencing violence and just continuing to have an entire community feel like they're under siege. The other thing that we need to do is we need to be honest with ourselves about the need for further accountability and reforms in policing. In the state of California, I believe there's room to expand the authority of the chief here in Los Angeles to actually terminate or fire individuals who are found to commit serious misconduct, and as well as a transparency as to the background of our officers and their involvement in other acts of misconduct. And lastly, an area that when officers are fired or removed from an organization, that the other agencies are made aware of that, and so that they have an opportunity to determine whether or not that individual is still worthy of wearing a badge for any law enforcement agency. So lastly, is this also a matter of ongoing training and a need to continue to refine our collective as organizations ability to recognize our history, understand how it impacts in every encounter throughout Los Angeles. As was identified by Mr. Wu, the scars that still exist from some 30 years ago in the Korean community. I saw firsthand, and was well aware of this last week during civil unrest, in which a Korean community asked, would they feel abandoned again? And I'm proud of that, by knowing that we are able to ensure that resources were dedicated to ensure the safety of those neighborhoods. When we started seeing looting, we started seeing violence in various parts of Los Angeles. So it's something that will not, this is an endeavor that will not take place in a day. The solutions are not easily wrapped up and delivered in a week or two. The nature of our path forward, though, needs to be more than words. It needs to have identified milestones, and I'm committed as the chief of LAPD to being a partner in that shared responsibility of how this country, how our nation comes to account for itself, of how it's treated the Black communities of Los Angeles and across the country, and how we've also impacted other communities of color and other groups that have felt that they've not been seen, they've not been heard, and they've not been recognized for the values as Americans that they are.
Chief Moore, thank you so much. The questions that we've been getting have been beginning to turn more and more towards specific solutions, legislative, regulatory, and otherwise. So I think what you've done in laying out an array of first steps is very, very helpful to the conversation. I'd like to come back to you again in just a few minutes. But first, I'd like to come back to Michael Lawson. Because Michael, this is a topic that I know you've thought long and hard about. So the chief has now introduced the reforms that he thinks make the most sense for our next steps. Let me put that question to you. In your eyes, what sort of police reform do you believe is most important? What should we be addressing as we engage with our elected representatives at the city, the state, and the federal level?
Thank you very much for that question. I don't have a priority list. There's so many. The fact is that what Chief Moore mentioned is one of the things that is not something that is top of mind, that the chief himself cannot fire one of his own officers that he believes is out of line, that is not worthy of wearing the badge. Now you multiply that, if the chief can't do it and the mayor can't do it, and there's so many different protocols out there that protect bad cops. And so that is one of the things that we have to address. Another issue that we have to address is, do we want the police doing everything that we're asking them to do? The police departments in Los Angeles and around the country their budgets are going north, in part because they are being asked to do things that social workers should be taking care of. We should be funding other agencies that should be addressing these issues. Literally, there's so many different issues that where the first thing we do is call the police, and they have to respond to them, but that's not what they should be doing, and they haven't been trained to do that. Community policing is an essential part of whatever the new police force looks like. We have to have police officers who know and understand the people that they are serving. And the LAPD has had a community policing task force where you have officers who have spent years in the same neighborhood. They know the people there. And that changes the dynamic between the officers and the community, that in and of itself. There are so many different aspects to this, which is why the current calls to practically start from the ground up and rebuild and say, this is not, what we have now is not what we want, and it can't, excuse me, it can't be fixed, it needs to be redone, is a cry that I believe we should be following. We need to rethink how and why police are where they are and what they're doing and how they engage with the community. I think everything has to be on the table. I applaud the Minneapolis City Council for doing just that. And I am I am a staunch advocate of the LA City Council doing exactly the same thing, taking a comprehensive approach at everything that is going on. Because what we have now is a system where we've just been putting Band-Aids on things and ignoring the very real elements that are keeping us from changing the dynamic. Again, we're not saying that all cops are bad, but there is a culture that is toxic. So even the good cops can't stand up and say anything. We have to tear this thing down and rebuild it in a way that we want it to work for us.
Michael Lawson,
when I say for us, I mean for all the people of Los Angeles. I appreciate everything that's been said by all the other ethnicities in Los Angeles. We don't need to be turning against one another. We need to be working together. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael Lawson. And what I will say is this is obviously such a broad and multifaceted conversation that our original estimation that a 60-minute, 1 hour long program would be sufficient to cover it was way off the mark. Out of fairness to both our panelists and our audience members, what we're not going to be able to do is expand this to the length that it deserves to go, which I would estimate being 7-8 hours today, days, weeks, and months, if not years going forward. So what I'll ask the other panelists going forward, somewhat unfairly, is in order to make sure that everyone else has a chance to weigh in a second time, as Michael Lawson just did, if you're able to focus your answers to a couple minutes each, that would be very helpful to us, recognizing that we're only scratching the surface. So I'm going to come back to Helen Torres now. And Helen, what we heard from both Chief Moore and from Michael Lawson were some fairly specific policy changes that are going to be discussed and debated in the days and weeks ahead. But I know you've also thought a lot about other changes that are necessary. In other words, in addition to changing the law, we need to, as we talked about earlier, we need to talk about changing behavior, about changing attitudes. What are the other necessary steps for us to take moving forward, even as our elected representatives work toward legislative change?
Great question, Dan. And yes, it does definitely mean that we should be having this conversation for over dinner and for a lot longer time. So hopefully we can continue the conversation beyond this 1 hour. So to get to your answer, and I was looking at some of the Q&A questions from the audience, some action steps that we all can take is understand that this is a mutual responsibility. Racism isn't just found in one institution. Today we're talking about the police force, and rightly so. It is in the front of our thoughts, and it is an institution that we look to protect and serve us. So we as a community, as residents of this great country, get to define how does that work for us. And so when it comes to our behaviors, we need to step up and take on the behavior of leadership and not leave it just to the politicians or the institution leaders, but for all of us to collectively understand how our taxes are being spent, how we're holding every level of government accountable to our values and goals. It can seem very daunting, but quite frankly, if you start, we're going to be doing this as an organization at Hope, incorporating in all our leadership programs, understanding the city and state budget, understanding where our monies are going is a key way to really be an advocate in the front lines beyond the protests and advocating for those distributions to be reflective of our values. Another key thing that we can do is really check ourselves individually as leaders as we represent a variety of different communities, how we're reaching across communities consistently, not for one opportunity, not for a one-off, but really building a trust that can be replicated in our local neighborhoods. And that comes to a comment that I saw in the Q&A. We do have a segregated community here in Los Angeles of where we live. of where the majorities are and where the minorities are. And we have to work harder to make sure that that segregation doesn't continue and that we come together and really do break bread and discuss the differences and really understand who we are and build that trust and community. And I think that is in the foremost of what we need to do. So we need to educate ourselves about the system that we have propped up. We need to take action and advocate for what our values are in that system and how institutions and their leaders need to be held accountable. And we need to ensure that we're reaching across ethnicities and races to make sure that we are truly coming together as a society.
Helen, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think you make a terrific point about the responsibilities that fall to each of us. Charlie Wu, I'm going to ask you this. It has not been lost on any of us that not only have the protests that we've seen in Los Angeles and across the country, not only have they represented a very broad range of racial and ethnic and religious and socioeconomic backgrounds, the other thing that's been noticeable is the tremendously large presence of young people. And so I'm wondering if you could talk, building off of Helen's point, about what we can do to make sure that the next generation of leaders' voices are heard and that they're part of this discussion in a positive and productive way.
Sure. One of the most gratifying, thing that I've seen is that, the protests by and large have been led by young people across different ethnic groups, different racial groups. And it's gratifying to see that the young people will take up a social cause that, on surface might not impact directly their own community, their own life, but willing to stick together because that was the right thing, that has been the right thing to do. Okay, I want to go back to our polling data. As much as, I was mentioning about, this is before COVID-19 and the racial uprising, was that although we remain very upbeat about the future, about, particularly our own neighborhood, that people are start working together. And one thing we couldn't help but notice is that the younger generation had felt more discrimination. Somehow they're more sensitive to it than we are. And they don't feel that, California and the United States, despite economic prosperity that we believe in, they are not as optimistic as some of us believe that they should be. And they feel more discrimination than as I said, than the older generation. And I think it's some, warning signal here when the young people do not feel a sense of optimism that some of us hope to feel. That's a problem. And I think one of the things that our government leader do is to invest more money in youth programs and encourage, create more opportunity for young people. I think that is exactly the right formula to go about doing it, because invest in the young people so that they not only speak up, but after they speak up, after this calm down, they continue to work on policies that are beneficial to create a seat for them at the table. So if we have invested in young youth program before, we have invested in different programs before, this is another important opportunity that we go back. But this time around, we need to have the young people at the table. Organization, the reason we did that poll was we want to have a longer view about future collaboration among African American, Latino, Asian organizations. Literally, we know that come about a lot sooner because of the COVID-19 and the racial tension that we have. And I think that the collaboration here, particularly our groups have been dealing with a lot of leadership development, young people. And I think that we have done the right homework. And I think future collaboration and getting make sure that young people are at the table, the community, I think Helen made a point that the local neighborhood and the statewide and regional level should be where we focus on, because that's where we make the biggest difference. That's where we should invest the young people into sort of part of the dialogue. And I think to some way that what we did back in February set a very good example how we should go proceed and make this a better country, better state and regional and neighborhood for all of us.
Charlie Wu, thank you so much. And I think it's worth noting that while this panel, I think, does an effective job of representing a range of gender and racial and ethnic perspectives, we do not have young voices on this panel. But what I will say is that all four of the organizations represented here run very admirable, very impressive, and very effective young programs for young people. And I think there's a lesson here for us, Julie, because what we've seen in these protests, like I said earlier, is young people from across the socioeconomic strata, lots of young people realizing that even if they don't feel like they're personally affected by these challenges, they want to be part of the solution. So I guess the question I have for you is, how can we take that lesson? How can we take that lesson and broaden its reach, not just to young people, but the people of all generations, those of us who might not face these challenges on a daily or frequent basis? How important is it for us to remember that we play a role in the solution too?
It's a great question. And you know, what Charlie was saying about young people really resonates with me a lot. I was, you know, in preparing for today, I was talking to every young person I could find that would talk to me about this. And it was hugely helpful in formulating my thoughts. You know, again, going back to educating ourselves and really the introspection and the listening and the learning, that's the first thing that we need to be doing. But we also need to be growing our capacity to do the work that needs to be done. What Helen's words, mutual responsibility, I think that is just so key. Every group represented on this panel has faced hatred at some point. So we really must work collectively. We need to learn from our existing coalitions, our existing coalition partners, and also we need to build new coalitions. We need to really double down to ensure reform in our policing system and issues of other systemic change regarding healthcare, education, greater access. We need to make sure that our elected officials are listening to us, that they're enacting legislation that will right the wrongs, especially towards the Black community. And we can't think that someone else is going to do it or that it can wait for tomorrow and, you know, go back to our normal lives next week. We can't go back to normal. We have to keep going. I just want to add one more thing in regards to policing. Since we have Chief Moore here, it's undeniable that the Jewish community has benefited from the good that the police offers. And this is obviously not true for everyone. And I really implore you, Chief Moore, to make sure that the police are for all people. The experience of vulnerable communities should not be any different than that of the most privileged communities. And we, as a Jewish community, really need to demand a break in that culture and in the secrecy that surrounds it.
Julie Bang, thank you very much. And so we'll come to Chief Moore for the final portion of today's discussion. And Chief Moore, I must admit that over the course of the last 54 minutes, I have come to between 75 and 80 questions that I'd like you to answer in the last 4 minutes, if that's possible. So while that's unlikely, what I will do is we got a number of questions from our listeners about not just police training, but about selection of officers. And I'm wondering if you talked about several different reforms a little bit earlier. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the front end of the process, selecting those men and recruiting and selecting those men and women who can make the kind of contribution we want, and making sure that they're properly trained to take on those challenges.
Thank you, and thanks for that. Let me center on that remark. We are, first of all, we're hiring. So to the extent that people who are young people, particularly that are interested in social justice reform and in seeing that policing is responsive to all communities, but that it rights itself away from in the past efforts of over policing or discrimination in communities of color, particularly the Black community, has been the last 2 years an effort for us to build our diversity, particularly in the Black community, Asian Pacific Island community, and in women, in the representation. The LAPD has just under 10% of its workforce that is Black, about 8% that are Asian Pacific Islander, and just under 20% that are composed of women in the workforce. Each of those three groups and the interplay between them as we build their representation, I believe we build a better police department, a department that is better informed and has a broader perspective of interpreting how its strategies, how its tactics, how its relationship with the community are hurt, and how those relationships with those communities are helped and improved. Now, in achieving that diversity, it's not automatic. This is still a male-dominated profession. So, and as far as the African American and Asian Pacific Islander communities, we have communities that can have resentment or can have cause for caution as to, is this really a profession that I'll be welcomed in, or that I can come in and can be effective and can thrive. So our work in this has been to open up that conversation and take on those issues head on and talk about the importance of criticality of from within changing this profession by hiring from our communities that are most impacted. Secondly, is we have to look at our standards, and we continue evolving them. So what are the things that are keeping, particularly, let's say, the Black community, a young Black man or a young Black woman, from coming on the job? And what we found is that in the past, our credit standards, some of the expectations of a person's financial history would be barriers to bringing individuals into the organization. So changing those so that they're more reflective of the economic challenges and uncertainty before us, because we're hiring, we're looking to give people good jobs, good pay, good benefits, so that they can thrive financially. And so the background standards, the inclusion by targeting and specific markets that we want to build and deepen our diversity, those are key reforms that I've been committed to. And unfortunately, this pandemic has interrupted. But now, with these last 2 weeks, with the renewal of this effort of righting social wrongs and correcting social injustices, it's never more important than today, than for those voices, those young people who are asking for change, is to become a part of that change. By coming in within the organization and ensuring that the culture is responsive and respectful of all communities, not just those that are privileged, but those that are, in fact, our work should be most centered in support of those communities that are least privileged.
Chief Moore, thank you so much. And while time does not permit us to allow each of the panelists to respond to the offer you just made, I'll be just presumptuous enough to tell you that all 4 organizations and all 4 communities represented on this panel will be very eager to work with you and your team to work toward accomplishing those goals. I want to take a minute before I thank our panel. I want to thank our audience members for joining us today. We had a tremendous turnout. I want to thank all of you for being with us. And I want to apologize to those of you who had really good, smart questions that I was not able to work into the conversation. I do want to thank our panelists, Michael Lawson from the Urban League, Helen Torres from Hope, Charlie Wu from Cause, Julie Bank, from the Jewish Center for Justice, and of course, Chief Michael Moore of the Los Angeles Police Department. I want to thank Beth Keane and Jill Brown and the entire team at the LA Museum of the Holocaust for all the good work they've done, not just putting together today's program, but all the good work they do on a daily basis, especially in their efforts to make sure that young people from underrepresented and minority communities do learn about the tragedy of the Holocaust, not just from a historical standpoint, but its applications for lessons toward solving the type of challenges we discussed today. This Wednesday, the museum will be hosting a discussion with Professors Michael Bernenbaum and Stephen Wasserstrom about anti-Semitism in the time of coronavirus. And then next Wednesday on the 17th, Michael Lawson, Helen Torres, Charlie Wu, and I will be having a conversation on this topic and more on a webinar for the LA World Affairs Council. So thanks again to our panelists, to our audience, and for the amazing team at the museum for a conversation that just scratched the surface on a series of important and necessary challenges, and a conversation that we will all be continuing in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe and be part of the solution.